Have you ever looked at a league table, seen your absolute favorite team suddenly get slapped with a massive points deduction and just thought, wait, do I actually need an accounting degree to understand football nowadays? If you found yourself utterly confused by acronyms like FFP, PSR, or amortized transfer fees dominating the sports headlines, you are absolutely not alone.
Welcome to this explainer. I am incredibly excited to be your guide today as we decode football's financial revolution. We're going to explore exactly how and why the balance sheet became just as crucial to a club's survival and its success as the starting 11 they put out on the pitch.
Okay, let's dive right into this. Here is our exact playbook for today. We'll look at football's debt crisis, the dawn of the financial fair play era, the legal battles over third-party ownership, the new rules for sustainability, and what this all means for the future of football.
All right, kicking things off with part one, football's debt crisis, when the bubble burst.
To really get how we ended up here, we got to travel back to the late 2000s. European football's finances were, frankly, spinning totally out of control. Just take a look at the staggering number, 8.2 billion euros. That was the combined gross debt held by European clubs by the 2008-2009 season. It's just a massive amount of money, right? The sheer scale of this debt established incredible stakes for the sport and forced regulators to realize they had to take unprecedented action before the entire system just collapsed.
And the details of this crisis, they are genuinely eye-opening. We're talking 56% of UEFA clubs reporting net losses. And this wasn't just, red ink on a spreadsheet. It triggered some really visceral realities. Take Portsmouth FC. They won the FA Cup in 2008, only to face total insolvency by 2010. Meanwhile, over in Spain, more than half of all professional clubs entered administration by 2012. It was a massive wake-up call that simply raking in huge TV revenues absolutely didn't guarantee survival if your expenses were running unchecked.
Which brings us to part two, the financial fair play era, trying to break even.
So, faced with that massive existential threat, UEFA rolled out Financial Fair Play, or FFP, for the 2011-12 season. But it wasn't built overnight. In its first iteration, it essentially just forced clubs to prove they were actually paying their bills, meaning no overdue payables to players, tax authorities, or other clubs. But regulators quickly realized that wasn't going to be enough. The system evolved to introduce strict break-even requirements by the 2013-14 season, basically demanding that clubs finally live within their generated means.
Now, what's really interesting here is how UEFA brilliantly separated taxable football income from excluded expenses to sort of clean up some very dense accounting rules. They obviously wanted to punish reckless spending on things like player wages, but they didn't want to kill positive investments, so they completely excluded spending on youth development, women's football, stadium infrastructure, and community activities from that break-even calculation. Pretty smart move, honestly.
Under FFP, clubs faced a rolling 3-season loss limit, though there were some allowances if owners reached into their own pockets to cover the deficit. And to actually enforce this, UEFA had to prove they weren't afraid of the big dogs. They handed down some serious sanctions to giants like AC Milan and Juventus. And, well, it worked, to a degree. The ultimate result was that European club insolvencies dropped dramatically, going from an average of up to 35 a year, all the way down to single digits.
Moving right along to part three, the third-party ownership battle. Doyen versus the regulators.
But, of course, as regulations tightened up, football financiers started hunting for new loopholes. To really understand this battle, we need to clearly define TPO, or third-party ownership. Basically, it's an investment model where a third-party fund hands cash to a club so they can buy a player. But in exchange, that fund essentially owns a percentage of the player's future transfer value. So when that player is eventually sold down the line, the fund gets a massive cut of the pie.
This sparked a fiercely polarizing debate. On one side of the pitch, investment funds like Doyen and leagues like La Liga argued that TPO was a vital alternative funding source. They said it actually gave smaller clubs a fighting chance to pay off debts and compete with the wealthy legacy teams. But on the exact opposite side, regulators like FIFA and UEFA argued that siphoning off future transfer values was a huge threat to long-term stability and would ultimately push clubs dangerously close to bankruptcy.
This ideological clash turned into a super costly, multi-year legal crusade. A really famous example happened when Doyen helped Sporting Lisbon finance the transfer of Marcos Rojo. Later on, when Sporting tried to deny Doyen their cut of his transfer to Manchester United, Doyen actually won the contract dispute under Swiss law. However, despite winning isolated battles like that, Doyen ultimately failed to win the war.
They couldn't overturn FIFA's global ban on TPO, and the Court of Arbitration for Sport officially upheld the ban in 2017.
And this case study perfectly illustrates exactly why regulators fought so incredibly hard against this practice. Look at the Dutch club FC Twente. They took these short-term TPO cash injections from Doyen just to stay competitive. But when they couldn't sell their players for the required minimum prices, they faced absolute financial ruin. It led to severe sanctions from the Dutch Football Federation, threats of relegation, and UEFA bans. That quick, short-term fix literally became a long-term disaster.
All right, Part 4, New Rules for Sustainability, from FFP to Financial Sustainability.
Because the financial landscape of football is constantly evolving, regulators really had to adapt. Let's see how UEFA's modernized system built a much more robust framework. They introduced 3 new pillars of financial sustainability for the 2023-24 season. First up is solvency, which brings in strict quarterly controls, not just annual checks, on all outstanding payables. Second is stability, which actually doubled the allowable losses to 60 million euros over 3 years for healthy clubs. And third, the absolute biggest shift of all, cost control. This cost control pillar establishes a strict new tactical formation for a club's budget. It dictates that spending on player wages, amortized transfer fees, and agent costs is strictly capped based on revenues. By the time we hit the 2025-26 season, clubs won't be allowed to spend more than 70% of their total revenue on their squad. It tightly, directly links a club's spending power to the money it's actually bringing in.
Which brings us to our final chapter, Part 5, the future of football, harmonization or fragmentation.
Now, UEFA's rules are a huge deal, but they aren't the only game in town. If we zoom out for a second, it's crucial to remember that UEFA rules only directly apply to teams that actually qualify for European competitions, like the Champions League. That leaves the vast majority of clubs across the continent subject to wildly varying domestic regulations, or, in some pretty crazy cases, barely any regulations at all.
When you look across Europe, you see these really stark contrasts in how leagues operate. Take Germany, for example. They focus heavily on strict licensing and positive equity, which results in incredibly low club debt. Then you have Spain's La Liga, using strict forward-looking spending limits that have successfully contained costs and kept pre-tax losses low. But on the flip side, Italy actually removed their domestic financial rules post-2020, and the result? Serie A clubs are currently the least profitable and most indebted among all the top leagues.
So the crucial point to take away here is that this regulatory landscape is actively and aggressively shifting right beneath our feet. The English Premier League is currently trialing shadow squad cost rules, very similar to UEFA's, but even more dramatically, both the UK government and Italy are exploring the unprecedented step of creating independent, statutory football regulators. Basically, governments are stepping in where the leagues themselves have struggled to keep their clubs sustainable.
The massive, ongoing debate at the heart of all this regulation is finding that optimal design. It's like a giant puzzle. How do you construct rules that prevent clubs from gaming the system and going bankrupt without accidentally locking in the dominance of the wealthy legacy clubs? Think about it. If you strictly cap spending to a percentage of revenue, the clubs that already make the most money will always be able to spend the most. That makes it nearly impossible for a new, exciting challenger club to ever emerge. And that brings us right back to the fan experience. Christopher Davis from Auxerra really hit the nail on the head here. Fans absolutely shouldn't need a PhD in finance just to follow the sport they love. At the end of the day, the game should be decided by the brilliance of the players out on the pitch, not by the tactical brilliance of accountants sitting in a boardroom hunting for loopholes in a spreadsheet. So, we've seen how mounting debt forced regulators to act, how rules evolved from simple break-even tests to complex squad cost caps, and how different leagues are fighting for survival. Which leaves us with this one crucial question. As money increasingly defines the pitch, will modern financial regulation ultimately rescue your local club from ruin, or will it permanently alter the spirit of the sport by stifling the underdog forever? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and I'll catch you in the next one.